Up next we have Trish Kane from Aftercare.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
We pulled the short straw because everybody knows that after lunch people tend to wane a little bit and the energy levels go down. So Anne-Marie did a great job in keeping you all awake. Good energetic voice. Well done, Phil, as well. So thanks for that. It was very insightful. And actually, it's the topic that Anne-Marie was talking about has actually inspired me to think about being cheeky. A little bit more about being cheeky. So look, my name is Trish Kane. I'm the Senior Support Facilitator here in Redcliffe, and in the very privileged position of having an office 500 metres down the road just off the beach. So it's a wonderful location to be in. So it's great to welcome many of you back to Redcliffe, or to Redcliffe for the first time, and have the opportunity to share this stunning location. So I'm conscious that time is of the essence, as they say. So what I'd like to do today is to present a case study. And while I'm not in my position in Redcliffe with Partners in Recovery for very long, certainly I was inspired by colleagues in other Partners in Recovery and colleagues in Redcliffe to consider presenting this case study to you today. So in many ways, the parallel with the issue around veterans, there's also a number of issues around offenders leaving prison, transitioning back to community, accessing service, and the amount of input that's required, I suppose, it's huge. And having really looked at this case study in a lot of detail and listened to my colleague Marg in particular with this guy, and I would have some dealings with this particular character from my time in FAMS, exceptionally complex, and trying to manage and negotiate some of the hoops that you have to jump through to try and allow people to access their basic fundamental rights. It does take a lot of effort. I'm not sure if Marg is around. Oh, Marg is there, for those of you that don't know Marg. I'm going to invite Marg and I'm going to invite Phil to perhaps jump in if they wish in terms of trying to clarify or pick up on any topics or themes that you might be interested in, because both Marg and Phil have contributed greatly in terms of doing some research and a lot of the legwork around some of the issues that these clients have been experiencing. We do have a case study just to pass around to you, but rather than have everybody reading it in detail, Marg has agreed to synopsize it for you, but Sarah's actually just going to pass them around, so you do have... I actually did. I thought there was only going to be 5 people. So there's about 30 copies, so you may have to share. So please share, and I'm sure if you really wish to keep it, we can get some photocopied for you. But Marg's happy to give a verbal synopsis of it.
It could take a bit of reading. So, back in September last year, I attended a housing and homelessness meeting that didn't have anything to do with discharge from prisons, but there was a worker there, a transition coordinator, and I presented a bit of a PiR initiative presentation, and she said to me, "I need to see you before you go." So we met after that meeting, excuse me, and she said, long story short, nobody will work with this guy. I've tried everyone, and no one will touch this man. It was her view that he would re-enter the system quite quickly within days of leaving the prison, or he would commit suicide. We were due to meet with this chap in the prison, but there was a measles outbreak, which meant that I couldn't get to him for 2 months. They wouldn't let visitors in. So I only met him the day before he was released, and I'll talk a little bit to his story. The day after his release, when he was supposed to call me, he was found on the gutter in Browns Plains. He'd made it all the way to the south side, and he had stolen a knife from Woolworths and was about to rob the Bendigo bank because he wanted to go back to jail. And it was at that point that I then had an opportunity to engage with him on the gutter with a colleague from Nimai who attended with me. Many thanks. So this chap is 29, he's a Bosnian immigrant. He came here when he was 9. He'd been to another of other countries, France and Germany, as a refugee. He had, I'd say, suggest a poor upbringing. There were a lot of assaults on him as a child. His parents were both incarcerated many times. The impact of war on the family was huge. So there was a lot of dysfunction there. He grew to have a history of drug use as a teenager, assaults on others, and finally ended up in jail, and that's where I met him. His diagnosis was in his early 20s with PTSD and a major depressive disorder. He was medicated for about 5 years. His meds changed when he went to prison, which brought about some disharmony for him, and he spent that entire imprisonment in the special needs unit. He has some developmental delays also. So a bit of a mess when he came to us. He wasn't medicated when he left prison. There were no prison services that were prepared to work with him. I think one of the challenges for this chap and for many is their appearance. Not just their presentation, but 6'2", covered in prison tats, speaks loudly, Bosnian accent, can be abrupt. If you listen to the words, he's fine. If you listen to what he's trying to communicate, he does that quite well. He's very articulate, but being loud and presenting like this, Centrelink wouldn't have him in the office. The Department of Housing refused to engage with him, and that meant that he couldn't access other services in our area. So early engagement, I found, was quite easy with him. All he wanted was someone to trust him, talk to him. So we had no issues in engaging, and I found that when people came to know him, for example, the motel manager where we had to place him was a veteran police officer of 30 years. I didn't tell my client that. He found out quickly. They became mates. And so he'll be a mate with anyone who engages well with him and trusts him and treats him with respect. And respect is a big thing for these guys when they come from prison. It's very hard to build trust in there, but respect is huge. So as we proceeded and as we engaged, I found out that he had a number of strengths, and one of them was an attachment to his psychologist that he'd known before prison. That was the only service at that point that we could reconnect him with. Over time, though, we have struggled to find services. In the first 4 weeks, Trish, I need to show this. So this is 4 weeks of referrals to 55 different agencies and the reasons why they wouldn't work with him. There's actually more than that, but that was all I could remember to record. I was a little bit busy. We managed to get a referral through to FAMS via Trish, and we had a worker who could work with this chap, and one of the big needs was getting him out into the community. He couldn't catch a bus. He'd have anxiety attacks. He'd think people were looking at him, judging him, and that limited what he could do and how we could proceed. I think you've got a list of challenges there. There's quite a few. I might leave you to the challenges and the outcomes. Yep.
Thanks, Mara. Thanks for that, Mara. Thanks, Sarah, for doing that job as well. And look, his story is probably not different to many clients that you've come across in a whole range of areas in terms of all the complex needs and the issues around accessing services. So I suppose go the other way. What I really wanted to do is just to give you a sense of why am I presenting this case study. And the data is not exact, but approximately 20% of our clients at the moment are ex-offenders who've been convicted. And that's pretty high. And I'm not sure, and something I'll talk to my PiR colleagues about, is to try and capture a synopsis of are you working with a similar cohort group as well? And the research generally indicates that 50 to 60% of recidivism occurs within the first 2 years of release, and particularly within the first few weeks. And as in that case that Marg talked about, immediately people do become very vulnerable if you don't have that support. And we talked about it in one of the groups earlier today, transition and discharge from hospital. In many ways, it's the same thing that we're talking about in terms of the parallels. It's about the support that we put in place at that stage. So lifestyle, drug use, mental health, lack of supports from family, friends, etc., they're all issues, and they all correlate to high recidivism rates, and the research clearly shows us that. And it's quite interesting, Marg saying that as well, that the prison staff and the psychologists, etc., they seem to know who's most likely to come back in and pretty quickly. And particularly it's those people who don't have the supports that they need. And really, I suppose the other reason, we just wanted to provide a narrative and talk about the evidence of some of the challenges that we face when we're working with this cohort group. And it's not that we have any solutions. We're really, I suppose, at the early stages of a journey, in many ways like Anne-Marie has presented earlier, of trying to say, right, how can we move this forward? And while we have some thoughts and ideas, and we're brainstorming a few potential actions, I am definitely going to take on the cheeky word, and it may well be that we just have to be brave and step up to the mark and present some of this evidence and data as well. So we may have time for a bit of discussion at the end, I'm not sure. So back to the same old situation. That's what our character was faced with. There were service engagement issues across the board. There were service gaps, so there were lots of services that we couldn't find, despite the fact that there were lots of services that we could find who wouldn't engage. Lack of knowledge regarding the services generally, and also in terms of mental health supports that are available in the community. The isolation that people feel, the fear, the anxiety, the lack of confidence and skills. And again, I guess it depends on how long somebody has been in prison for. Lack of coordination in case management. Like, whose role is it? Who takes over? Who can I go to who will be a constant? Who do I know? So while we have transition coordinators, their roles, it ends. It ends from when you walk out the door, essentially. There's very little by way of follow-up. And if people are aware of other services and follow-up that is there, we'd really like to hear about it, because we do intend to take this agenda a little bit further if we can. Lack of family and social supports for many people. Insecure housing, as Marg said. Lack of clarity on who should do what. And I suppose when we were brainstorming this and trying to identify some of the key challenges, we were saying, so what could be done better? Preparation in terms of pre-release, so before going back to community, what can be done better in the prison setting? And ideally, Marg should have had the opportunity to go in, but what else can we do? What can we do better? And again, on relation to once you're back in the community, who's going to keep an eye on me? Who do I check in with? And the types of roles that Marg has talked about, really, there are multiple roles. There's a few of them: befriending, peer coordination, negotiating, advocating, mediation, financial planning, medical planner, liaison officer, counselling, listening, problem solver, and so the list goes on. And that's what many of us do, particularly when we work in this sector pretty much every day. So it's pretty complex and it's exceptionally time consuming. And knowing this character and knowing the story, it would be interesting to actually see how many hours, days, weeks of time have actually gone in to working with this guy. But you know what? He's still out. He has not gone back. And that is pretty incredible. And I have no doubt that in the first instance, if Anne-Marie and Marg hadn't gone and picked him up from the gutter, that he could have gone back in pretty quickly. But he could have gone back in within the first few weeks, but a lot of time and effort went in there. And that's why I thought it was important we present this, because this is 1 year on and he's still out. Did you want to come in, Phil?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, we've also been working with an ex-prisoner for a long time, ever since I started, basically. And it's been an off and on relationship. It's really difficult to connect. It's often about when he wants something, he comes to get it from you, and you feel like you're sort of being used a bit in some ways. But essentially what really happened there was he decided he was going to be homeless for a long, long time so he could pay some of his debt off. You know, he had all these debts that he wanted to pay, you know. And I found that remarkable that he'd stay out on the riverbank at Strathpine rather than, you know, move into a house and have to pay rent and all that.
Yeah.
But eventually what happened was we started talking about we can't get him into housing, there's all sorts of problems. Yeah, he's got tats all over him, his attitude's probably a bit dodgy, you know. You could say that he's a bit aggressive at times, you know, and his behaviour's sort of not quite what you'd like, you know. But what really happened was that we started talking about, hey, let's try and find a place to live on Gumtree, right? So we'd just basically given up on trying to find anywhere. He didn't want to be in a boarding house. He didn't want to be in a hostel or crisis shelter or anything like that. He wanted his own place, all right? So we did that and was strikingly unsuccessful. I remember taking him somewhere and just knocking on the door, and this lady looked at him and said, "Can I meet you down the shopping centre?" So we went down to the shopping centre and they sat down for 5 minutes. Then they said, "Oh no, sorry, you're not suitable to share a house with us," etc., etc. But eventually he found some place himself. Okay, and then all we did really was to facilitate that, was to provide some funding to actually get him, to make it easy for him to get in there. Now, I hope he's still living. He found a place where he had a half a house under the house, and he had his own independent place. A bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen, so he was independent and could live.
Great. Yeah.
Having said that, while all the time that he chose to live on the riverbank, he would come and we'd give him some food or something like that. I mean, he made an active decision not to be housed because he wanted to pay off his debts. And then every now and then we'd put him in a motel overnight so he could have a shower, good sleep, and then he'd be back on the riverbank.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for sharing that. I'm just going to go on the last few slides. I am conscious of time. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time for the other wee video clip, but I'm sure the PowerPoints will get posted somewhere. And there's a clip to quite. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the 1/100th series. There's a whole range of stories. There's a wonderful resource, and there's a whole range of stories about people managing their recovery and their mental illness. And Craig's is particularly good because he's also he's come out of prison and he's had to try and adjust and readjust, etc. So it's a really nice one, and I think we can get you probably access to the link for that if anybody's interested in it. I guess, look, I don't want to bore you to death and bore you to tears with policy, legislation, research, etc. I'm not in the business of doing that on a Wednesday afternoon. But there is this very interesting piece of legislation, Pathways to Reduced Crime for All Offenders. Some of you may be very familiar with it, I'm not sure. But in terms of systems reform and thinking about opportunities, I think that this is a wonderful opportunity, this document. It's actually quite easy to read, which is quite nice. It's always an added bonus, but it provides an opportunity for, I guess, mental health services to try and pick up on some of the statements and the actions that have been put forward by the Department of Correctional Services. And I think that it's certainly from a Partners in Recovery's perspective, I think it's definitely something that we can look at, and we can start to try and request meetings, see if we can get some doors open and use something like this as I suppose just use it as a strength in terms of trying to put forward cases like the one that we've presented today. So I do like it, and it does have some pretty good data in it. And what I particularly like is that it names mental health for a start as one of the priority groups that DCS are going to look at, those inmates that have mental health issues on transition to community. And it has also named a whole range of actions, but I've just selected a few there. And I guess in, I suppose, the true spirit of consultation, it talks about being open and willing to meet with the key stakeholders who are working with that cohort group, particularly around their mental illness. And from our perspective, it's certainly a conversation that I would like to have with colleagues and anybody else that's interested. And let's see if we can get some cheeky proposals together and maybe move that agenda a little bit further. So in terms of that, I guess in the short term, what we can do is continue to try and capture some data and some evidence around this particular client cohort group, and we'll certainly try and get some from other colleagues as well. Continue to negotiate and liaise with key stakeholders, research on various models of offender re-entry, and there are certainly a range of models out there, not just in Australia. There's a couple of good ones from various states in America. WA have quite an interesting model, the 3-stage model as well. So I think it's just finding the time to dedicate to this particular agenda and try and see, can we pull something together that looks like a proposal for how we might begin negotiations and discussions around doing things a little bit better. Use those actions that are outlined in that document and just begin the process of finding out, first of all, who are the key stakeholders, who do we need to invite to come along to meetings, present some data, and then look at some of our kind of collectively identify what are the priority areas that we need to be looking at. And we're definitely open to all suggestions, and certainly contact myself, colleagues, etc. afterwards. And if you've got some thoughts, ideas, certainly if you know of who some of the other stakeholders are, I'd be really happy to take some ideas from you. If you know of various models, please let us know so that we can begin putting something together around that. And I know that on Friday, there's also a whole other area to be looked at in terms of Indigenous prisoners. And this Friday we have something set up where we're going to start having some meetings with, what's his name? Norm, yeah. So Norm's coming through on Friday, and yeah, he has a real passion for trying to support Indigenous men, particularly when they are released from prison, and there's a number of little initiatives and models that they're looking at to try and support those guys in particular. So yeah, we're just going to start some conversations and see where it takes us. Thank you.